How did non-Euclidean geometry affect other fields?
The relationship between space and geometry changed forever in people's minds. Thanks to non-Euclidean geometry, the question arose of whether space itself was curved. This made the whole of geometry seem hypothetical and led some to question the possibility of a priori knowledge.
How did Islam contribute to Christian European philosophy?
Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars worked cooperatively in the Spanish libraries, established by Muslims, that were important centers of learning, as well as locations for book collections. The greatest achievement was the rediscovery and translation of ancient Greek texts done first by Islamic scholars. Aristotle was resurrected and became the fulcrum of scholastic educational activity. During the same time, both Islamic and Jewish thinkers became known to European philosophers, who respected them highly.
What is GRU?
Nelson Goodman, 1906 to 1998, supposed that all emeralds before time t, which is the present, are green. But if this is true, then G is also true. Emeralds before time t are green, or emeralds after time t are blue. The reason it is true that emeralds after time t are either green or blue is that the time after time t is the future, and we do not know what the future will hold for emeralds or for anything else. G defines the predicate GRU, a term Goodman made up, as a quality of emeralds. All of the emeralds that qualify as GRU could be blue after time t. Nevertheless, Goodman maintained that we would prefer to call them blue after time t. He believed this showed that confirmation cannot be a purely logical or syntactic process, but that it reflects our linguistic preferences, which go beyond what we actually know.
Why is materialism important regarding the analytic philosophy of mind?
Whether the mind is equated with the physical brain or held to be closely connected to it. Analytic philosophers of mind have been united in a materialist view since Gilbert Ryle, 1900 to 1976, wrote The Concept of Mind, 1949.
What were some of Josiah Royce's metaphysical ideas?
Royce's metaphysical system was intended to solve the problems posed by a religious worldview. He believed that what exists is a totality of everything that is known, so that the nature of being can be understood by understanding how it comes to be known. Although knowledge starts with data from the senses, to arrive at the idea of a public object. As well as a past and future, transcendence is necessary. Transcendental judgment is not isolated, but part of a system of judgments. Such a system can account for error as a failure to define an object. An idea is a purpose that seeks an object, but the object in turn clarifies the original idea. The infinite is real, because the absolute, which is one, represents itself along with everything else that mirrors it.
What was Gilles Deleuze like as a person?
He did not like to furnish autobiographical information, claiming, "Academics' lives are seldom interesting." His fingernails were extremely long, but when it was suggested that this was a sign of eccentricity, he replied, "I haven't got the normal protective whorls, so that touching anything, especially fabric, causes such irritation that I need long nails to protect them." In the same interview he said that the fact that he did not travel did not mean an absence of inner journeys.
Who was John Dewey?
John Dewey, 1859 to 1952, was the most famous philosopher in the United States during the early 20th century. He was a public intellectual during the decades when ordinary people, as well as intellectuals, filled halls to hear intellectually stimulating and edifying speeches. His interactive, pragmatic approach to ordinary life, education, and art appreciation has shaped American experience in fundamental ways that do not always refer to him by name. Although, or because, Dewey was shy, he wrote 37 books and more than 700 articles. His main publications include Psychology, 1887, Human Nature and Conduct, 1922, Experience and Nature, 1925, The Public and Its Problems, 1927, The Quest for Certainty, 1929, Philosophy and Civilization, 1932, A Common Faith, 1934, Art as Experience, 1934, Liberalism and Social Action, 1935, Logic, The Theory of Inquiry, 1938, Freedom and Culture, 1939, and Problems of Men, 1946.
How did Johann Gottlieb Fichte become famous?
Soon after Fichte met Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, in Königsberg. His first book, Attempt at a Critique of All Revelation, 1792, appeared. It drew connections between religious revelation and Kant's philosophy. Fichte had not shown it to Kant before publication, and Fichte's name did not appear as the work's author, so the book was assumed to be by Kant. Kant generously cleared up this misunderstanding, giving high praise to Fichte, who immediately became famous. The accolades were hyperbolic. One reader wrote, "The most shocking and astonishing news, nobody but Kant could have written this book." This amazing news of a third son, the other two being Kant and René Descartes 1596 to 1650. In the philosophical heavens has set me into such confusion.
Did Galileo contribute more than a defense of Copernicus to science and philosophy?
Yes. Galileo, 1564 to 1642, is credited with having founded modern mechanics by proving the laws of gravity and acceleration. He also discovered the principle of independent forces and created a theory of parabolic ballistics that accounted for the trajectory of projectiles by positing parabolic arcs for their movement. His innovations in the technology of science included an air thermoscope, a machine for raising water, and a kind of computer for geometrical and ballistic calculations. In pure science he discovered the isochronism of the pendulum, that the oscillation period of pendulums of equal length is constant, and he invented the hydrostatic balance, an accurate device for weighing things in water and in air. With the use of telescopes, he discovered the moons of Jupiter, the existence of mountains on our moon, and sunspots. He also described the Milky Way in greater detail. His claim that there were blemishes or what we would call sunspots on celestial bodies was in itself heretical to some church authorities. Philosophically, Galileo insisted on completely naturalistic causes for the observable world. But he did not object to postulating remote or unobserved causes, according to a retroductive inference. His method of analysis involved taking effects apart and then theoretically putting them together in a new way to fit postulated causes. Insofar as this was a form of hypothetical inference, it is surprising that Galileo was unwilling to appease the Church by calling the Copernican system merely hypothetical. Galileo further angered Church officials, while supporting scientific researchers, with his claim that biblical accounts should not be taken literally by educated people.
What was Spinoza's philosophical system?
Although Spinoza's system had very strong theological elements and he was motivated to construct it for the ethical purpose of determining how to live, he did not base morality on God, but rather on adequate human knowledge. Such knowledge would enable both an ability to control the passions and live peacefully with others. However, indirectly, this knowledge of nature amounted to knowledge of God because, according to Spinoza, God was present throughout nature. Spinoza wrote philosophy in the form of geometrical proofs, and began with axioms from which he proved his conclusions. First, he made the assumption that substance exists. Substance, he continued, has infinite attributes. But humans can perceive only two of these, extension and thought, or matter and mind. Spinoza's metaphysics was a monism. Only one thing existed, and that was God. God, according to Spinoza, was a being absolutely infinite. Although God had infinite attributes, each one of which expressed his nature without limitation to itself, humans can perceive or understand only two of God's infinite attributes: thought and material bodies, or extension. Each attribute has both infinite modes and finite modes, although finite modes are infinite in number. A person, for example, is one finite mode of God. Existing in God as both a mode of thought and a mode of extension. One way of understanding Spinoza is that mind and matter are different ways of viewing the same thing that exists in God. As everything that exists, God is nature, but nature is also God. Spinoza distinguished between natura naturans, or God in his active role as creating, and natural naturata, or what we humans perceive as nature.
What are some of Peter Singer's views?
Singer, 1946, has at times argued that the lives of healthy adult animals are of greater value than those of severely impaired human infants. Such views have met with great controversy. When Singer was hired by Princeton University in 1999, there were dramatic public demonstrations by and for disabled people. And the university administration hired armed guards to protect him. Singer, proceeding on utilitarian grounds, does not believe that animals have rights, but rather that their well-being is intrinsically good and their pain and destruction intrinsically bad. Singer is not a deep ecologist, because he does not attribute intrinsic value to the well-being of mountains, rivers, or plants, or whatever is not sentient. Singer has claimed that the privileging of human life and well-being over that of animals is speciesism, which, in principle, is no different from racism and sexism.
What did George Berkeley think of matter, extension, and other mainstays secured by René Descartes and refined by John Locke?
According to Berkeley, matter and extension. The main property of matter that was supposed to be its occupation of space, were abstract, general ideas. Which is to say that the words naming or describing them did not refer to real ideas. Since only ideas, minds, and God exist, matter and extension did not exist for Berkeley. There was nothing real corresponding to them. Berkeley applied the same criticism to our presumptive ideas of causation and the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. He looked for the ideas of sense or imagination to back them up, and found none. In the case of causation, Berkeley was basically an occasionalist.
Quine on the analytic-synthetic distinction.
In 1957 Putnam published the article The Analytic and the Synthetic. In the anthology Minnesota Studies in the Philosophy of Science, edited by H. Fagel and G. Maxwell, 1962, in which he showed how the history of the definitions of kinetic energy made it impossible to divide statements about kinetic energy into analytic and empirical, or synthetic ones.
How did William Whewell describe the method of science?
In his 1837 book, History of the Inductive Sciences, Whewell described scientific methodology as a three-part process. Beginning with a prelude of isolated facts, progressing toward laws or generalizations, and culminating in colligation by scientists during an inductive epoch in which a theory is created. The last stage is a sequel in which the theory is refined and applied to new facts.
How did environmental philosophy get started?
Popular environmentalism began in the 1960s and 1970s when marine biologist Rachel Carson, 1907 to 1964, traced the movement of toxic pesticides, specifically DDT, through the food chain in her classic book, Silent Spring, 1962. Intellectually, this led to a rediscovery of ecologist and forester Aldo Leopold's, 1887 to 1948, land ethic. A Sand County Almanac, 1949, and the thought of John Muir, 1838 to 1914, founder of the Sierra Club. Leopold had written, that land is a community is the basic concept of ecology. But that land is to be loved and respected is an extension of ethics. This moral tone set the basic philosophical orientation toward environmentalism as a moral/ethical matter. The Norwegian philosopher Arne 1912, was inspired by his encounter with the Himalayan Sherpas' reverence for their great mountains when his guides would not take him to sacred places. Nice developed an important distinction between deep ecology and shallow ecology.
What was Noam Chomsky's argument against behaviorism?
Chomsky, 1928, objected on the grounds that the speed with which a child learns a language and demonstrates an ability to form correct new sentences, even without hearing grammatically correct speech, implies that this language ability has not been learned. Behaviorism was fundamentally a theory that all human knowledge and behavior, including language use, was learned.
What is philosophy?
Philosophy is the activity of seeking wisdom. In Greek, which was the first language of Western philosophy, philosophy means love of wisdom. One loves wisdom by trying to figure out what it is. There are many ways human beings seek wisdom, including art, religion, and lived experience. Philosophy is distinct because it seeks wisdom through the systematic use of reason. Philosophers focus on ideas, the meaning of ideas, and beliefs by analyzing them. They break them down into their parts and then build them back up again and combine them in new ways. In addition to analysis, philosophers reflect on what goes on in the mind and the world. They seek wisdom through intuitions of whole structures of thought or experience.
What is the Lens Crafters Society?
While the members of the American Philosophical Association, APA, in the 20th and early 21st centuries have been, for the most part, employed as academic philosophers, not everyone with a Ph.D. in philosophy is able to find work as a professor, and some of them do not have other jobs, either. The APA has tried to accommodate these unemployed philosophers at its annual meetings. And it sponsors an organization for them that is called the Lens Crafters Society. In honor of Spinoza, who polished lenses for a living.
Why did Sokal do this?
He explained it this way: I'm an unabashed old leftist who never quite understood how deconstruction was supposed to help the working class. And I'm a stodgy old scientist who believes, naively, that there exists an external world. That there exist objective truths about that world, and that my job is to discover some of them. In other words, besides thinking that, and showing how postmodern thought was of poor intellectual and scholarly quality, Sokal did not believe it served a worthy political purpose. Sokal, along with Jean Bricmont, a physicist professor and philosopher of science, further developed the critique implied by Sokal's article in their book Fashionable Nonsense, 1997.
How did Aristotle's main ideas compare to Plato's?
Aristotle rejected Plato's claim that only the forms are real and that there is another world of forms outside of the world that we perceive in ordinary life. But he agreed with Plato that knowledge must have certainty. Therefore, his main philosophical task was to describe what made objects real in this world and explain how we can have certain knowledge about them. He also developed a system of logic, or rules of thought, that would guarantee certainty if one began with premises that were certain.
When and how did the scientific revolution begin?
The scientific revolution began with Nicolaus Copernicus, 1473 to 1543. Heliocentric theory and the rediscovery of ancient Greek atomism in the 15th and 16th centuries. But it was not until the end of the 17th century, after Isaac Newton's, 1643 to 1727, work, that it was clear to educated people in Europe that a full-blown scientific revolution had occurred.
What was George Santayana's contribution to pragmatism?
Other than the fact that Josiah Royce, 1855 to 1916, was his teacher and C. I. Lewis, 1883 to 1964, argued against his intuitive theory of knowledge. It is not always clear how Santayana was a pragmatist. The philosophical convention places him within that group. Mostly due to time and place and the pragmatist philosophers he interacted with while living in the United States. Still, Santayana's ideas about aesthetics, reason, philosophy itself, and human nature share a common spirit with William James, 1842 to 1910, and John Dewey, 1859 to 1952. Santayana's theory of aesthetics was that beauty is the experience of pleasure in the form of an object, rather than the effects on the sense organs of the person experiencing the artwork. He claimed that all preference is basically irrational and that values are based on pleasure. His take on reason emphasized human creativity in science, religion, society, and ordinary life, as well as more obviously in art. Overall, he identified human beings as animals, inhabiting a physical world, oriented toward food, and fearful of danger. Santayana thought that nature was a kind of backdrop within which we have our experience. In The Life of Reason, 1905 to 1906, he described nature as drawn like a sponge, heavy and dripping from the waters of sentience. The nature of nature is thus conditioned by our experience of it. These views characterize his early work. After he left Harvard, Santayana wrote about metaphysics and ontology, emphasizing objective reality as opposed to human experience. But Santayana himself did not acknowledge this change in his subject matter, and in his later writing he claimed to be providing a more comprehensive and rigorous foundation for his earlier theories of art and experience.
Who were some other women philosophers of note from antiquity?
In the 3rd century c. E. Julia Domna, the wife of the Roman Emperor Septimius, supported a group of Stoic philosophers, studied with them, and helped them flourish. In the 4th century, Macrina preserved Greek philosophy after her family was persecuted by Christians.
What did Wollstonecraft claim on behalf of women?
Mary Estelle, 1666–1731, and Elizabeth Elstob, 1683–1756. Preceded Wollstonecraft in arguing for women's recognition as thinking persons. Estelle claimed that women were entitled to be educated. Her reason for this was that women had the same God-given capacity to reason as men. Her justification for educating women was that this could help them be better wives and mothers. Wollstonecraft shared Estelle's views and defended them more systematically. She also claimed that the current treatment of privileged women as spaniels and toys was demeaning to them. She took Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712–1778, to task for claiming in his hugely popular novel Émile 1762, that women should be educated to provide soothing pleasure to men. She wrote openly about female sexuality and the emotional vulnerability of women to rakes, arguing that women were educated to be impulsive, emotional, and gullible.
What is the problem caused by intersectionality?
The result of all the intersectionalities has been a widely accepted equation that race plus class equals gender, resulting in a multiplicity of women's genders that prevents the possibility of women working together or even identifying in the same way. And the result of that is an unspecified number of feminisms. Once different women's genders are recognized, it can be very difficult for them to reunite as women. For example, in their essay Have We Got a Theory for You? 1998. Maria C. Lugones and Elizabeth V. Spellman use a dialogue to show how some differences in Angla and Latina cultural experience simply cannot be translated into each other's framework of understanding.
What is Noam Chomsky's own theory of language?
While Chomsky has developed different versions of his theories over the years, often abandoning his own followers of previous versions, most commentators agree that overall themes and trends in his thought amount to the claim that linguistic ability or language in a general syntactic or grammatical sense is hardwired into the human brain as a physical structure enabling a linguistic faculty. Chomsky has posited a universal grammar that limits the group of possible human languages. In philosophical terms, this is a rationalist, rather than an empiricist, approach to language. Thus, in Cartesian Linguistics, 1966, Chomsky clearly stated, in affinity with René Descartes, 1596–1650, that human language is innate and that human beings universally share this capacity. It should be noted, however, that Chomsky is a materialist concerning mental activity, whereas Descartes believed that the mind was a non-material substance.
What are some key facts about Charles Peirce's career and life?
Charles Sanders Peirce, 1839–1914, was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His father, Benjamin, was professor of mathematics at Harvard University and a founder of the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey and the Smithsonian Institution. Benjamin Peirce is also said to have built the Harvard Department of Mathematics. At the age of 12, young Charles discovered logic, and at 16, he began his independent study of philosophy. In 1859 he graduated from Harvard, unsure of what I would do in life. His primary interest was in logic, for which there were no career opportunities. He practiced geodesy for several years and returned to Harvard to study natural history and philosophy in 1861. He got a Ph.D. in chemistry in 1863, graduating summa cum laude. Peirce continued his studies of logic on his own and has been considered to be one of the greatest logicians of all times. Although he disagreed with Immanuel Kant's 1724–1804 insistence that space was Euclidean and later moved to Friedrich Hegel's 1770–1831 objective idealism, Kant remained a dominating influence over his philosophical ideas. Peirce's philosophy was a distinct form of pragmatism, which he called pragmaticism.
What was John Rawls' theory of justice?
Rawls, 1921–2002, began by positing justice as the cardinal virtue of society. All societies value the concept of justice in a primary sense. Although they have different conceptions of justice. Rawls' conception of justice was that it can be understood as fairness. On that model he proposed that a society would be just if its fundamental institutions were just, which would entail equal access to official positions. As a way of determining how fundamental institutions could be just, Rawls proposed a thought experiment that posited an original position. In the original position, the framers of just institutions would do their work behind a veil of ignorance. This veil of ignorance would prevent them from knowing their own positions or interests in the society whose institutions they were framing. Rawls wrote, "No one knows his place in society, his class position or social status. Nor does anyone know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good or their special psychological propensities. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance." Rawls' thought experiment guarantees a hypothetical condition of disinterestedness on the part of original framers. This posits them as Kantian rational agents, who because they are autonomous or self-ruling, can and should make choices about what is most important in their lives. That they do not know their personal interests but nonetheless frame institutions that will affect everyone's personal interests is fair in the same way as having One child cut a piece of cake and the second child choose the piece she wants. The premise that individuals with interests in society consent to the basic institutions echoes the necessity for the consent of those governed in social contract theory. Social contract theory is also based on the premise that government must justify itself as beneficial to those governed. Rawls' original position promises a test of even greater benefits than allowed by original social contract theorists, such as John Locke, 1632–1704, who assumed that only property owners would be represented in government. Rawls' model permits us to ask whether anyone in society who could be represented behind the veil of ignorance would choose a given state of affairs. If not, then that state of affairs is not just or fair.
What is non-Euclidean geometry?
Euclidean geometry depends on a number of axioms, most important of which concerns the property of parallel lines. Non-Euclidean geometry changed Euclidean axioms. It was to have application in physics, particularly Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, when it enabled a concept of the fourth dimension. Carl Friedrich Gauss, 1777–1855, was the first to figure out the principles of non-Euclidean geometry. Although because he did not publish his ideas, the credit was given to János Bolyai, 1802–1860, and Nikolai Lobachevsky, 1792–1856, who were working independently. They rejected the Euclidean assumption that could not be proved, in which only one line passes through a point in a plane that is parallel to a separate coplanar line. In their new system, a line can have more than one parallel end. The sum of the angles of a triangle may be less than 180 degrees. By the middle of the 19th century, Bernhard Riemann, 1826–1866, developed a geometry in which straight lines always meet, thereby having no parallels, and in addition allowing for the sum of the angles of a triangle to be greater than 180 degrees. In Euclidean geometry, parallel lines never meet and the sum of the angles of a triangle is always 180 degrees. Riemann also went on to distinguish between the unboundedness of space as part of its extent and the infinite measure over which distance could be taken that is related to the curvature of the same space. Riemann returned to Gauss' now published work and explained the new ideas of distance first introduced by Lobachevsky and Bolyai in terms of trigonometry. The bottom line was that arc length could be understood as the shortest distance between 2 points on a surface, without reference to the geometric properties or applicable geometry of that in which the surface itself was embedded. In 1868, Eugenio Beltrami, 1835–1899, demonstrated a model of a Bolyai-type two-dimensional space, inside a planar circle. This proved that the consistency of non-Euclidean geometry depended on the consistency of Euclidean geometry. thus reassuring skeptics that non-Euclidean geometry was valid.
What was Thales' contribution as the first philosopher in Western history?
It's not the content of Thales, c. 624 c. 545 BCE, thought that proved to be so important, but rather his willingness to boldly think about the whole of physical existence. Thales' home was Miletus, which had strong ties to Egypt. Like the Egyptians, he believed that the earth floated on water and that water or moisture was the primary substance or stuff of the world. Aristotle thought that Thales had been impressed by the importance of water and fluids for life generally. Indeed, Thales seems to have thought that life is present in every part of the universe and that it was divine. Hence, he is said to have remarked, "Everything is full of gods." Thales' most striking and novel insight was that the movements and qualities of water could be used to explain the behavior of living things, as well as natural events. The behavior of water was, in that way, a primary moving principle. A primary moving principle was a thing that was responsible for the movement of all other things. At the same time that water was held to be the primary stuff of the universe.
What is logical positivism?
A new generation of thinkers who were influenced by Bertrand Russell. 1872–1970, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889–1951, created a 20th-century version of Auguste Comte's 1798–1857, 19th-century intellectual endorsement of science. The term logical positivism was coined in 1930 by two supporters, E. Keila and A. Petzal. Philosophers who were part of the early movement that logical positivism came to represent. The 20th-century positivists Moritz Schlick, 1882–1936, Rudolf Carnap, 1891–1970, Otto Neurath, 1882–1945, and in England, A. J. Ayer, 1910–1989, were members of what became known as the Vienna Circle.
How did Imre Lakatos' research program reconcile Popper and Kuhn's work?
Lakatos, 1922–1974, described a scientific method to both allow for progress and explain how science had developed. Instead of talking about theories, he introduced the notion of a research program, which consisted of both theories and accepted research practices in a given field. Every research program has a core, or protective belt, of claims that could not be falsified. Degenerating research programs have growing protective belts and fail to predict new facts or create new projects for discovery. They survive by adding ad hoc hypotheses. Progressive research programs are able to support new projects of discovery that do not produce vast amounts of falsifying data requiring revision of the core. They do not significantly rely on ad hoc hypotheses. The way that Lakatos reconciled the discrepancy between Popper and Kuhn's account of science was to shift ground from the static relationship between facts and theories to the dynamic nature of scientific practice. Popper's view was that scientific truth changes when theories are falsified, whereas Kuhn thought that theories were not falsified so much as overthrown. Lakatos made scientific practice, rather than beliefs about the truth of theories, his subject.
How did feminist epistemology develop?
Nancy Codoro, 1944, showed in The Reproduction of Mothering, 1978. How social roles within the nuclear family are reproduced socially by girls. Identifying with their mothers and boys becoming unlike their mothers. Recognition of the social construction of female gender resulted in broad rejection of biological determinism of women's traditional roles. This cleared the way for feminists to seek social causes for the disadvantageous status of women. Carol Gilligan's, 1936, in A Different Voice, 1982, criticized Lawrence Kohlberg's account of moral development because it left out the relational nature of girls' moral perceptions. In contrast to the more abstract and individualistic nature of boys' moral development. The idea that women had relational identities led to an ethics of care, most notably based on Stanford University psychologist Nell Noddings Caring, 1982. Which was foundational for the work of Sandra Lee Bartka in Femininity and Domination. 1990, and Eva Kitte's Love's Labor, Essays on Women, Equality, and Dependence, 1999. Genevieve Lloyd's The Man of Reason, Male and Female in Western Philosophy, 1984. Sparked a view that philosophy itself had been identified with distinctively masculine capabilities of reason to the intellectual as well as literal exclusion of women. These perspectives led to the articulation of feminist epistemology, stressing connected, rather than individual knowers, or people who learn and come to know things, and the role of emotion and action in knowledge. The collection of papers in Linda Alcoff, 1955, and Elizabeth Potter's, 1947. Edited work Feminist Epistemologies, 1993, relates some of this groundbreaking work to traditional epistemology. An additional development of feminist epistemology is feminist philosophy of science.
What was Rosicrucianism?
Rosicrucianism was the practice of the secret Christian Rosicrucian order, which was dedicated to helping mankind develop spiritually. The practices of the Rosicrucians were not published or otherwise known to the general public. but they were believed to involve ancient Neoplatonic knowledge, alchemy, and ways to cure the sick. Some believe it began after Dante degli Alighieri, c. 1265 to 1321, wrote the Divine Comedy in the early 1300s. Others locate its beginnings within a group of German Protestants in the early 1600s. 3 documents circulated throughout Europe in the 15th century to promote what the Rosicrucians called the universal reformation of mankind, Fama Fraternitatis Rosicrucis. Confessio Fraternitatis, and Chimical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz anno 1459.
What were some of Leibniz's original contributions to philosophy?
Leibniz's major works include the Monadology, 1714, Discourse on Metaphysics, 1686, Theodicee, 1710, and the Leibniz-Clark Correspondence, 1714 to 1715. As well as political writings and a large body of unedited material. Leibniz had a very complex view of the universe that defied common sense, was theoretically fascinating, and preserved core Christian beliefs. His philosophical writings were highly complex and had their own terminology. He claimed that his philosophy was based on these general principles: principle of identity, principle of the best, principle of sufficient reason, metaphysically necessary principles, principles of order, principles of causation, and the principle of the natural. In addition to this, he used the idea of monads as the basic unit of what was real.
What was Franz Brentano's main contribution to empirical psychology?
Brentano's lasting importance lies in his emphasis on the intentionality of conscious states and attitudes. He pointed out that thoughts, beliefs, hopes, desires, and the like, which Bertrand Russell (1872 to 1970) was to term propositional attitudes, are directed towards some object. For instance, if you are thinking about an apple, then your intentional object is the apple you are thinking about. If you want a new car, it is the car you intend as an object of that desire. Because physical states are not intentional in this way. Intentionality is a basis on which what is mental can be distinguished from what is physical. Brentano identified 3 different kinds of intending: ideas, judgments, and the phenomena of love and hate. The last, also known as emotions and volitions, are directly related to morality. Although an earlier version of Brentano's doctrine called immanent intentionality suggested that the object intended was in some way literally in the mind, he later explained that although there is always a mental object for consciousness, the object need not literally exist. The point is that one can think of a thing that does not exist. Objects of thought that do exist have strict relations with other objects that exist, whereas those that do not exist lack them.
Did Auguste Comte believe in altruism?
Yes. In fact, Comte coined the word altruism, meaning an obligation to help and serve others, even at cost or harm to one's own self-interests.
Who is Jürgen Habermas?
Jürgen Habermas, 1929, is a German philosopher and social theorist who combines the critical theory of the Frankfurt School with American pragmatism. With this combination he is postmodern in his emphasis on public speech and dialogue as a political way of life. His engagements with contemporary thinkers from Jacques Derrida, 1930 to 2004, to John Rawls, 1921 to 2002, to Pope Benedict XVI, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, exemplify his theory. However, it should be noted that unlike most avowed postmodern philosophers, Habermas defends Enlightenment democratic values. Habermas' major works include The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, 1962, Theory and Practice, 1963, On the Logic of the Social Sciences, 1967, Knowledge and Human Interest, 1967, Toward a Rational Society, 1967, Technology and Science as Ideology, 1968, The Theory of Communicative Action, 1981. On the Pragmatics of Communication, 1992, The Post-National Constellation, 1998, Old Europe, New Europe, Core Europe, 2005, The Divided West, 2006, and with Joseph Ratzinger The Dialectics of Secularization, 2007.
What was Bertrand Russell's theory of definite descriptions?
Russell gave an account of how it is possible to talk meaningfully about things that do not exist. According to his theory of definite descriptions, what a proposition of the form X is Q means is: there is exactly one thing that is X and that one thing is Q. Or, at least one thing is X and no more than one thing is X and whatever is X is Q. Russell's theory makes it possible to distinguish between the contradiction of X is Q and X is not Q. To use Russell's example, A, the King of France is bald has as its contradictory, A, there is no King of France, or there is more than one King of France, or there is one King of France who is not bald. But, B, the King of France is not bald means, according to Russell's theory, B, there is one King of France, no more and no less, and he is not bald. And, A and B do not have the same meaning.
What was Al-Kindi's main contribution to philosophy?
Abu Yusuf al-Kindi, c. 800 to 850, known in Latin as Alcindus, had both a noble heritage and an important position in the caliphate. The governing body representing Islamic leaders, headed by the caliph. He promoted the introduction of Western philosophy into the Arabic world, with a focus on Plato and Aristotle. Unlike his successors, he believed that there was a literal correspondence between the metaphysical writings of the ancient Greeks and parts of the Quran. His work was closer to Neoplatonism than Aristotelianism, and the tradition he began is contrasted by scholars to that of Mato Ybn d. 940, who founded a school of Aristotelianism in Baghdad.
What did Aquinas contribute to metaphysics in the non-religious sense?
Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, was very interested in the question, what does it mean to be? He sought to understand reality as a whole and tried to formulate explanations of all experience in terms of ultimate causes. About metaphysics in relation to its considerations of immaterial substances. He said, although this science considers these items, it does not think of each of them as its subject is simply being in general. Taken literally, this claim about metaphysics describes it as transcendent of religion. Because religious entities have being and their being is the subject of the most general philosophical study. Metaphysically, Aquinas determined that every being is distinct and undivided. Unum, it has meaning, verum, and there is something good about it, bonum. Aquinas distinguished between what a being is and that it is. What it is its essence, and that it is its esse. We can know the essences of things without considering their existence. But it requires an act of judgment to determine esse, that something is.
What are the highlights of Alfred North Whitehead's career?
Whitehead spent the first 25 years of his teaching career at Trinity College, Cambridge. Whitehead and Bertrand Russell, 1872–1970, distanced themselves from each other after. Russell became a pacifist during World War I and Whitehead's son was killed in that war. Whitehead taught at the University of London and began publishing works on philosophy of science, such as Principles of Natural Knowledge, 1919, The Concept of Nature, 1920, and The Principle of Relativity, 1922. His most important work as a process philosopher was Process and Reality, 1927–1928. Which was published after he moved to the United States to accept a position at Harvard.
What was Francis Bacon's New Atlantis about?
Francis Bacon's New Atlantis was published in 1626 and went through 10 editions by 1670. In it was described the House of Solomon, a research institute with laboratories for experimentation and observation in the natural sciences to include heat, light, cold, medicine, minerals, weather, crafts, astronomy, animals, and agriculture. There would be a staff of 36 fellows and their assistants, who would set out to make discoveries. Resident scholars would read written works on past discoveries. 3 interpreters of nature would assess all of this information to construct axioms and principles.
Why was Pyrrho important?
His refusal to make judgments was an important school of skepticism that was developed after the Renaissance and during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Known as Pyrrhonic skepticism. It was the general philosophical approach that many things in human life cannot be known.
Who was Ralph Barton Perry?
Ralph Barton Perry, 1876 to 1957, is best known for his theory of value and his realist views. But he received a 1936 Pulitzer Prize for his biography of his mentor and colleague. The Thought and Character of William James, 1935. Perry received his Ph.D. from Harvard in 1899 and taught there from 1902 to 1946. His main publications include a 1925 revision of Alfred Weber's History of Philosophy, The New Realism, 1912, General Theory of Value, 1926. Puritanism and Democracy, 1944, The Realms of Value, 1954, and The Humanity of Man, 1956.
Have some philosophers criticized consequentialism?
Elizabeth Anscombe, 1910 to 2001, in a 1958 article, Modern Moral Philosophy, coined the term consequentialism when she criticized 20th-century versions of utilitarianism that did not distinguish between intended and unintended consequences. Anscombe argued that only intended consequences have moral value. Anscombe is also famous for her defense of Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225 to 1274, Doctrine of Double Effect, DDE. According to DDE, an action is morally permissible if it has known bad consequences, but it is not the intention or goal of the person performing the action to bring about those consequences. In Jesuit moral reasoning about performing craniotomies, operations to crush a baby's skull so that the baby can be extracted to save its mother's life, DDE has been used. If it is not the obstetrician's goal to kill the baby but merely to extract it, craniotomies are deemed permissible. Anscombe provided this example: say she meets her mortal enemy on a cliff. If her enemy falls off because she accidentally falls against him, she is blameless. Even though the unintended effect of the enemy's death is welcome to her, after the fact. Others have criticized the ways in which consequentialism seems to ignore issues of justice in cases where an unjust act or even a human sacrifice might serve to maximize benefits for others.
Who was Drive? Pangloss?
The brilliant French satiric essayist François-Marie Arouet de Voltaire. 1694–1778, pilloried Leibniz's philosophical optimism with the character of Dr. Pangloss in his novel Candide. The character Candide is the illegitimate nephew of a baron who starts out life in luxury, with Dr. Pangloss as his teacher. Pan is Greek for all and gloss means tongue, speech, and words, so that Dr. Pangloss translates as Dr. Altok. Dr. Pangloss teaches the Metaphysico-Theologo-Cosmologologia to Candide. This teaching is a caricature of Leibniz and the poet Alexander Pope's philosophical optimism, which Voltaire found very difficult to reconcile with real human suffering, such as the devastation caused by the 1755 Lisbon earthquake and the oppression of the Ancien regime in pre-revolutionary France. The view of philosophical optimism held that because God is good, everything in the world must be good, as well. It is, in fact, the best world it could be, and everything in it, including what appear as evil to us, is, in the grand scheme of things, inevitable and for the best. Here's a sample of Voltaire's satire in which Dr. Pangloss expresses his belief. It is demonstrable, said he, that things cannot be otherwise than as they are. For as all things have been created for some end, they must necessarily be created for the best end. Observe, for instance, the nose is formed for spectacles, therefore we wear spectacles. The legs are visibly designed for stockings, accordingly we wear stockings. Stones were made to be hewn and to construct castles, therefore my lord has a magnificent castle. For the greatest baron in the province ought to be the best lodged. Swine were intended to be eaten, therefore we eat pork all the year round, and they who assert that everything is right, do not express themselves correctly, they should say that everything is best.
Was F. H. Bradley also an idealist?
It's not clear whether Bradley was an idealist, though he did believe that our direct experience of particular existence is what we can call reality. In his second major work, The Principles of Logic, 1883, Bradley attempted to construct the metaphysical system that would explain his ethics. Thought is embodied in judgments, which must be true or false. Ideas are the contents of judgments and they represent reality. Ideas also represent kinds of things. each member of which is a particular individual, in the sense of an object. For example, you can have the idea of your particular pet dog, Rover. And that idea represents just Rover, but you also have the idea of dogs that represents all dogs. However, all judgments are hypotheticals claiming that certain universal connections exist in reality. For example, if one makes the judgment that dogs are good companions for humans, one is claiming that dogs in a general sense that applies to all. Dogs are good companions in a general sense that applies to all human beings. But such a judgment is hypothetical because you might have a dog that is not a good companion for you. Reality is the sum total of everything that there is in the world, and as such, reality is what Bradley called a concrete whole. One encounters reality by the experiences that one has. That is, judgments are abstract, whereas reality is particular. For this reason, thought can never fully represent reality. Another way of putting this is that the real world cannot be completely described and classified by us. Finally, in his Appearance and Reality, 1893, Bradley further explained that reality, as experience, is all blended in harmony. Bradley thought that relations such as bigger, smaller, before, and after are appearances, not reality. Relations are abstracted by thought from direct experience of reality. This direct experience taken altogether is the absolute, and, in a surprising turn, Bradley concluded that the absolute, or the totality of our experience, is the real reality, as opposed to something that our experience could be experience of. In other words, Bradley held both that our experiences are experiences of reality and that all of our experiences added up constitute reality.